Have you seen Community? There's
All
a
the
really
time.
good episode where Britta suddenly becomes the really popular girl in school and she totally shifts who she is. And there's this moment where her and Jeff are having a conversation and he says, "Stop being high in your own drama." And she stands up and goes, "High on my own drama?" I feel like that happens on set sometimes where it's like, no, this is exactly what needs to happen. And this is the creative direction that we are going with this. And it's just, you're still just a person. Like, come on.
Hello, I'm Shawna Carroll. I am a post producer and film editor. I've had the great privilege of working on some extraordinary projects from scripted to doc to reality, short form, long form, you name it, I've done it. I've also seen my fair share of fixative post. This podcast is my homage to the many incredible people who work in post but often get forgotten behind the bright lights of the red carpet. Notes from Post is where I give Post a platform to give notes instead of receive them. On today's episode, I'm talking with Kiel Thorlton. He's an award-winning writer-director whose short films and feature film have won multiple awards. He has his master's in fine arts in directing and currently teaches in between creating content. He's also an incredible friend, and today we're going to talk about his first experience in post with his feature. Hey, Kiel. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's just dive right in. Talk to me about the process that you went through and finding an editor and working with an editor on your first feature.
The whole process was really interesting. So initially, we really considered editing it in house. In other words, myself and a producer and my director of photography. Because we'd been attached to the project for so long, I was at the time really unsure about handing the project over because I had handed projects over to editors in the past and I had some scenarios that didn't really mesh out too well. We reached out to 8 to 10 different people that we thought might be interested in taking on a project like this. From those interviews, I was unconvinced by one, I was slightly convinced by another, and I was willing to go with a third who happens to be on the other side of this podcast right now.
You make that sound so great. Willing to go with.
Willing to allow this person who was playing in the major leagues take a chance on this project. Obviously, Shauna ended up becoming the editor for this. We sat down. I'd never met you before. I had a really open conversation about it. I had been secretly, and I think I told you this in earnest afterwards, I'd been secretly hoping to have a female perspective on the edit because the film itself, although it comes from the perspective of a father, there's so much about the mother that's tied into the film because it's her absence in this
Yeah.
family, and it's almost living in the shadow of her. I really, really wanted that perspective when you and I began to talk. You were saying a lot of the same things that I was already thinking, which we found later on in post that was still the case. And obviously, we don't hate each other because now we're doing this podcast and talking about other projects. But there was a lot of similarities that creatively were happening. And I recognized and realized that this particular editor could bring something to the table. Now, in the back of my head, in that initial meeting, I still knew, okay, let's say we go through this whole process and that the edit ends up being crummy. I still have it. And I could still take the groundwork that was there and be able to manipulate that if I wanted to. But I wanted to be able to have somebody speak into the process. Because I wrote it and directed it, I really was worried that if I took a third crack at this story, that the story would be worse because of it. Because it was a feature, it wasn't short. And there's a lot of chances and a lot of different things that can happen inside of a feature film that somebody else could speak to. Yeah, I think that's how we ended up narrowing down to you. To obviously your work was really good. I talked to a few people about you. They were all positive.
It was also just that we vibe. The few conversations that we had, there was definitely a mutual understanding of the project and of where it wanted to go.
I felt that way too. I think if I remember correctly, I think you and I talked maybe on the phone for like 15 minutes one time. And then we had that conversation while we were
Yeah.
both on break at lunch, which lasted too long, which was a good sign. You want to if you're going to have a meeting with somebody who's going to be creative with you, you want the meeting to be like, oh crap, I gotta
We
go. I'm
gotta
already
go.
late.
Yeah, exactly.
And then once we did that, I had a couple other conversations with other editors. I'm just now realizing this. This is the exact same way we casted our lead. When we casted our lead, flew out to LA and we had our first sit down with him and he killed it. Every other audition past that, I get done with it and we talk about the person and I go, but it's not Ben. And I felt that same way with you in particular, because there were a few key people that were brought in this project that I didn't know before this project. And so even when I had other conversations with about other people or thinking through the process, I go, yeah, but that's not Shauna. I'm gonna trust her and we're gonna see where it goes.
We're gonna see where it goes, but I'll still be able to edit it if I really hate what she does.
I mean, that's what I was thinking. I didn't know you at the time. Like, that's exactly what I was thinking. And
And from
spoilers for anybody listening. Now it's no, I have Shauna. Like, that's not, I don't want anybody else. That's what I want. And the film is better for it. The film is 100% better for it.
I had a ton of questions. Remember, I came with my notebook
Yeah. You
after
had your
reading the
notebooks.
script,
Uh-huh.
and I had a ton of questions, and you answered every single one basically exactly how I would have answered them. And so I was like, okay, this will be good.
Especially when you're talking about your first feature, is that most of the time people aren't doing this and that's all they're doing. You and I were both working pretty substantive full-time positions in film and television. I know you did, and I know I did. I had an extensive conversation with my spouse. So did you about like, hey, this is how it's
Yes,
going to have to happen
yes,
because your day and my day were really similar. It was like 8 a.m. to like 5 or 6. You get 30 minutes to grab some food, and then you hang out and edit for like, I don't know, another 3.5 hours that night. Go
yep,
home, get some sleep, turn around, do it all over again.
yeah,
And that really open, honest conversation and realizing that in a project like this, there's a lot of time that you have to
yeah,
commit if you want it to be good. I mean, you can commit very little time and it's okay,
yeah,
but
or
that
crappy.
time makes
But
a big difference.
I don't know if you remember one of the very first conversations we had. It took me a little while to kind of get comfortable, really giving you my raw, unfiltered opinion and
Right.
comfortable with you. You also received it very well. We were able to collaborate on a different level.
Right. Yeah.
And
It goes back
so,
to that. It just goes back to time. You can't rush that relationship either. Finding that person that you're going to work with, even if they're great, it's still going to take time
yeah,
to get to that
yeah,
point to where you're comfortable sharing honest feedback because somebody's going to have to step in and tell you if something's crap.
I'm really good at that.
But they do. Like at the end of the day, I tell my students this all the time is that nobody who watches your thing cares. Unless it's your mom or your friend, they could care less. They're not going to be able to go, you're not going to be able to say, well, look at this cut instead and tell me how you feel about it. Or, well, there were these issues that this is the best that we could do. Nobody cares. Someone has to be honest with you early and say, this doesn't work. But it takes time to get to that point
Yeah,
with,
yeah,
especially
it
somebody
really
who's
does.
never worked before.
It really does. And if you don't have a good experience or haven't had that as a director, if you haven't actually had that relationship yet, that can be a scary thing for sure.
Yeah.
And so I am just super grateful that we ended up connecting, that you ended up bringing me onto the project, and then we ended up being able to collaborate the way that we did because I also enjoyed
Uh,
helping you learn how to work with an editor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did teach me. So sit down with somebody that is like specifically in that craft. It, you have to be able to recognize that there are things that they're doing or things they're saying or processes that you don't understand. You might be a musician, but you play the piano and you think you're good at guitar. But if you sit down with somebody who really understands how to play guitar and knows a lot of intricacies, there's things they're doing that you're unaware of, even though you could absolutely teach 80% of the population how to play guitar.
Yeah. When I work or edit with producers or showrunners, because I do a lot of television,
Yeah.
they all kind of understand the language of talking with an editor. They've done it so many times, it's just kind of second nature.
Mm.
So when I was working with you, it actually took me a minute to get into that groove, so to say, or to also figure out that communication with someone who was new to the process, which I think is why it ended up taking me just a little bit longer to have those tougher conversations with you. Because I knew what you wanted, but I also knew that in certain aspects, what you had in your head wasn't going to work out. And so I would try new things
Yeah.
And sometimes those new things, you were like, no, let's try it this way. And so I would go back and redo it like the way that you had in your head. I think one of the things that was a breakthrough with us in the editing process was I would do that. You would realize that it wasn't working, and then we'd go back to how I had
Yeah.
it or to an updated version along the line of where I was at. And so that really built the trust between us,
Yeah.
I felt.
Yeah, I agree. I think that process is important because if you don't take the time to marinate that idea, then you're always going to second guess. If you just go, that's good enough, then in the back of your head, it's going to be like, well, man, what if we would have tried that? What if we would have done this? And I think a lot of our conversations, I almost like credit it to like we were speaking almost the same language. So it was like I was speaking Spanish, but so were you, but you were in Spain and I was in Mexico. Like it's the same language, but there are some nuances there that are not
Yeah,
quite the
yeah.
same. But yeah, absolutely trying those things. But some of that falls on the director of being able to say, hey, let's try this. And then being able to sit down, watch it and go, nope, that was a bad idea. You can't. Like seriously,
It's
if you're a
true.
director
It's so true though.
and you
Yeah.
can't do that, you're making your project worse for your own gratification, which means nothing.
We have to go through the process of trying it because if we don't, then where we end up, we'll never be able to fully know if that's the best it could be.
Right.
I've talked to some film editors who've worked on major films. What they have said is, I'll go through, I'll do my cut, I'll show it to the director. The director will have me go through doing all of these different things, but then we'll end up back where I had it because he can accept that all of these things weren't going to work or didn't work the
Right.
way he thought it in his head. And it's that I think that is super important. And I think it's important for an editor to be able to be okay with that process. And some editors are, they prefer to just do their thing and be trusted and move on. And they don't, I've worked with editors who don't like a lot of notes, but I think that it makes you better
Right.
going through the steps. It also strengthens your relationship with your director, but your relationship with the project as well.
Well, and your relationship with the audience, because just like with directors, you're not going to be able to show multiple cuts. You're saying, look at me and how I can edit. Well, this is your shot. How do people feel about it? So there's a couple scenes I'm thinking of in particular as you talk about kind of marinating through this process. We watched the film as it was scripted, the first like couple of drafts. And you already had an idea in your head about it, about something that needed to be removed and kind of a big something that needed to be removed. And as a director, once I got to like probably the second rough, I was thinking it as well. We hadn't communicated this, but we had both individually been thinking, hmm, I wonder if this should be removed. And we're talking about cutting, two entire scenes of a particular character. Eventually, it got to the point where one of us said, hey, what if we remove both of these scenes in the end of the movie? It's going to trim up the fat on the end, and it feels like it's not giving us what we wanted. And the other one of us was like, well, I was already thinking that. If you don't have the chance to go through that process, if you just take your first cut at face value and say, yep, that's the way it's been scripted, that's what it is, it's what it has been for 2 years at this point, then you're discrediting yourself. It's like writing a script once and saying that's good. If you're listening to this and you write scripts, you should write a singular script more than once. But it's the same process, even when we need to remove two full scenes, just not replace them, not move them around, just
Not
go,
tighten them, just completely lift them out. Yeah.
just let them out. They're gone.
That as an editor is probably the hardest thing for me to talk about when talking to a director because I know just how much went into making the scene. And
Sure.
so I'm like, "Ooh, this could be so much better if like the pacing, overall pacing would be better without them."
And I remember we just cut them. And one evening we just watched like the last 20, I think, maybe the last
Yeah.
20
Yep.
minutes or
For sure.
so. And we were both like, yeah, it works without them. And so as a director, yeah, it kind of sucks because one of the scenes in particular was kind of a culminating moment for one of the actresses for her character. We ended up making her character smaller. That's something that really, I mean, it's a producer's, job. But as a director, you got to think about those things. These people came on set, they put their time and effort and energy into it. And then you're saying, well, we're actually going to cut this particular scene that has a lot of your emotion in it because we're making your character smaller. Like
Yeah.
that that's a challenging conversation. And she and I have actually talked. She came to the premiere and was talking to me about it. And I kind of explained what was happening. I said, look, the scene still exists. You're still going to have access to it. Uh, and so that way you can use it for your purposes. But that's another weird thing that's challenging about it. And I didn't expect the conversation to be as much about this, but there is a lot when you're a director working with an editor, there's a lot that falls on you as a director. It's not you just sit in the back seat and watch this person work. Obviously, you have to talk, communicate your ideas, but you have to be able to honestly reflect on your work and know whether it's good or not. You have to. And if you don't have that self identification to be able to do that, there's only so much an editor is going to be able to do because they can tell you, hey, we should try this until they're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, it's your project. And that's hard and it's a little bit scary, but you have to
Yeah.
know what stuff you're making works and what doesn't.
You were also willing to onboard someone else's
Yeah.
perspective. Not a lot of first time directors are willing to do that. You know what I mean? Like first time directors on a feature film, they're like, no, this is my baby. This is exactly how I have it in my head. I'm not going to let anyone else deter me about this and what my vision is on this. You hear a lot of these things like, oh, the director's vision is always the best vision, but that's not necessarily the truth. And specifically with you, you were open to criticism, but also just more information.
Yeah.
And
I mean, thank you. I'm a big collaborator. I love hearing other people's inputs on whatever they feel like might be effective. Now, at the end of the day, I have to make the decision, right? But I think we get a lot of filmmakers and creatives that, as bluntly as I can say it, think too highly of themselves. And there's nothing wrong with being positive in who you are and being confident. I ooze confidence. My wife hates it. That it's just like confidence everywhere. But you have to be able to recognize you're probably not that right now.
yeah,
And that's okay. But don't go into your first indie feature length thing and just assume that because you made this and because the story's so great that everyone's going to pick it up. You're going to get some crazy 6, 7-figure distribution deal that Netflix is going to pick it up day one and that you're going to be able to run with this. There's too much else at stake and it makes you come across as less intelligent. Directors in general need to understand they're still. Have you seen Community?
yeah. Oh my
The
gosh.
TV.
Yes.
There's a
Multiple
really
times.
good episode where Britta suddenly becomes the really popular girl in school and she totally shifts who she is. And there's this moment where they're having her and Jeff are having a conversation and he says, stop being high in your own drama. And she stands up and goes, high on my own drama and slaps the table and everybody starts cheering for her. I feel like that happens on set sometimes where it's like, no, this is exactly what needs to happen. And this is the creative direction that we are going with this. And it's just, you're still just a person. Like, come on. It's,
That's my cold open. Thank you very much.
I, if community with me is in your cold open, I have done something right.
That's good.
I also want to just briefly touch on when it's not working. And I want to talk about how it's okay to walk away, especially if
Right.
a director and editor cannot see eye to eye. And if there's any contention or you as a director don't feel like you're able to get the product that you want from your editor, it's okay to walk away. It's probably better. It's better for you. It's better for the editor. It's better for the project as a whole to walk away. And so I do want to talk about that.
Yeah.
I want to talk about how it's okay to do that and also okay to find another editor or to bring that up to like if you are talking to networks or you are talking to studios, it's okay and producers, it's okay to talk about that and it's okay to look for someone else as a replacement, as long as you're very communicative about it. I would not
Right.
recommend doing it behind the scenes or to stab anyone in the back. I think that most editors tend to be pretty chill, and so I think they know, at least I always know when a project is not for me. And a
Yeah.
lot of times, like, I'm a head of post, I'm a post production supervisor, post producer, and so when I'm having to replace an editor, I'm very upfront about it because I don't want my editor to
Right.
feel like they've been stabbed in the back or betrayed. And so, but it is important to know when to walk away. So I just want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it is really important to know that in any position, in any industry, know when the relationship isn't working. Now, that doesn't mean you have one bad night or week and you're like, no, this isn't working. I'm leaving. Like, you can't, you've got to let it marinate and make sure that it's not working. You also have to adhere to whatever the contractual obligations are, right? If you and this editor have agreed that you're going to do, repasses over 6 weeks or something like that, make sure that you're going through the process that the two of you have agreed to. If it's getting close to the end of that and you realize that it's not working, like you said, as long as you've been communicating along the way, more than likely this will not catch somebody off guard, right? Because it's
Yeah.
this relationship and you can tell if it's working or not. And it's okay. It's okay to be able to do that. You still got to pay them, you still can't like just
Yeah.
go, it's not working, so never mind. You've agreed to that, but it's okay. It's okay to do that as long as it's coming from a place of, I don't think this is working as the best for the project, not just, you don't
You
shower often
annoy me,
enough
so
and I'm out. Right. So as long as it's coming from the place of, hey, this isn't what's going to be best for the story. This isn't what's going to be best for the project. That's okay. It's okay to do that. And you should always find a way to do that in a way that has you come across in a very professional manner, because you don't
yes.
know who they know.
Yes.
And 5 years down the line, you get access to a project and you talk to somebody who happens to be friends with this person in the industry. And they're
Yep.
like, well, you know what? They 5 years ago shot me in the foot and just kicked me to the curb one day.
Yeah.
So make sure that when you're approaching these kind of situations that you're as professional as humanly possible.
Yes, it's super important to be upfront. It's super important to be honest and professional. And also don't talk bad about people. Just because they're not necessarily your cup of tea, it doesn't mean that they're not going to fit someone else really well in a director editor relationship. I think
Right.
that is also super important. Don't talk bad about people. Be as professional as possible and be upfront when you're talking about a really hard topic like that.
Right. It's the same thing I tell my kids. Don't be mean. Don't be mean. Talk to people, look them in the face, and it's
Oh,
okay
that's
to
too good.
talk.
Okay, I would like to know from you what was the hardest part about collaborating with me? And what was the most surprising part? What was the thing you weren't sure about or you thought was going to be hard but ended up not being? And then what was your favorite part?
The hardest part was probably by rough cut 2. I've let this thing go, and this person's now working with it, and me eventually having to make a decision and a choice and recognizing at that point, like, no, I'm gonna trust this person. So trust trust is earned, right? Built. It's not just given. And although I handed the project over to you at that point, and I felt like it was gonna be a good idea, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. I would hope anyway. There comes a point where you have to say, nope, I'm going to trust this person. And it's not going to be day one, unless you already know the person, you've already worked with them before. It's probably going to be week 2 or week 3 where you're like, nope, they know what they're talking about. We're going to get through this together. I think that's the hard part right there, is then almost unashamedly being like, this is my editor. This is what she's doing. And I trust her. I think that was the hardest part for me, was that moment of saying, yep, this is exactly how this process is going to work and it's going to be better for it. The most surprising part through the process was probably a little bit later on towards the end, where as I was watching it, recognizing that it was just so much better. I went into it, and I think a lot of directors will do this too. They've written the script, they feel really good about it. They've had a great production experience, they've had some good performances, da 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 da. And then they just go, great. Now the editor is just going to make this blueprint appear and it's going to be great. So for me to recognize that three-fourths of the way in, because three-fourths of the way in, there were a couple major changes that had taken place. And for me to sit back and look at it and go, this is so much better than what I thought it was going to be. And that's not necessarily a knock on the script or the knock on the production. It's just a part of the process. Once you get the visuals out there and you start looking at them and the pacing and everything else that goes into editing, it should be a better project then. So just like the script, it was better when we were on set because the actors added stuff to it. I added stuff to it. The cinematography added to it. There's a scene that's reoccurring throughout the movie of our main character walking down the hallway and acting like he's going to go into his bedroom and he can't do it. He grabs he grabs the blankets and covers and he goes and sleeps on the couch. That was scripted in a certain way that I felt really confident about. Then when we got on set, it was so much better. The same thing happened in editing where it was just so surprising to me how much better it could be in the hands of somebody who was a little bit more separated from the project and who was able to put their own spin on it. It's almost as if I do this all the time, that I adequate a lot of filmmaking to cooking. I love cooking. And so I feel like an editor is somebody I walk in as a director and I go, here's this farm organically raised chicken. Here's these beets I grew in my backyard. Here's all these ingredients. And I want to make a pie. Can you make this pie for me? And think about how much a chef puts into making a pie. Yeah, they got all the ingredients and they know they want to make a pie, but the way they make it, do they grill the chicken? Do they bake the chicken? That process makes the pie so much better. It's the same thing.
You're not the first person to correlate food with editing.
I just love food so much.
I had an editor once who literally was like, you can bring me the ingredients, but if you want me to make spaghetti sauce, you have to give me tomatoes. You can't bring me ice cream. I can't make
It's
spaghetti with
perfect.
tomatoes.
That's such a good analogy of like, hey, I really want this intense drama to feel intense. And you're like, this is a comedy. Like,
Yeah, exactly. You have to bring me the ingredients to make it what you want. Otherwise, if I can make something, but it's not going to be what you want it to be.
that's so good.
Okay, the third part was, what was your favorite part about collaborating with a professional editor?
My favorite part was the learning process. Collaborating and sitting down with somebody who lives, eats, and breathes inside that field makes me better. I'm very much a proponent of trying to learn from everybody I come in contact with. More than likely, I'm never going to be a professional editor. Like, that's not going to happen. But I want to understand that process because it makes me better as a filmmaker. With you specifically, worked out really well. I feel like I've told you before, you're inside my inner circle of friends. But that learning process was so much fun at the end of it when I was able to look back on the process and go, man, I just feel like I'm so much better. It's the same as now. We've talked about the movie before and on the backside of it now with all the stuff I've learned. And I feel like the movie is good and it's been reviewed well and it's done. It's got a distribution deal. Like, so obviously it's okay. But I feel like I'm so much better as a director. Even now that the process is done, I'm like, man, if I could go back and do this or, these little tweaks here and there. And I feel the same way when I went through the process of that, of editing with you and just seeing everything that happened. And I don't know, the whole process was fun. There was one night at the same time we were editing next door, they were doing a giant Christmas celebration. Do you remember this?
Yes.
And so obviously we had been working and we get hungry. And so we're like, well, let's just go over there. And we go and there's a German booth full of like brats and all kinds of stuff. We walk up. I'm like looking around trying to figure out what to do. And you're like, oh, you want this, 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 and this. I was like, how do you know that? You go, because I'm German. And I went, you're German? What? How did I not know you were German? And so you're walking up telling this lady what to get. And I'm like, this is like a whole other person I've never met before. And I walked out of there with like this plate of food. And I'm like, well, this looks delicious. I don't know what I'm eating right now, though.
But I'm going to eat it because I trust Shawna. So.
Right, exactly. The trust had been formed. And then now we're back to food.
Food. Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah.
I always love chatting with you. Always love working with you. I hope we get to work together again soon.
That's the plan, right?
I got to get you to move here first.
We'll see what happens.
Okay.
Thanks, Shawna. Thanks for having me on.
Well, that was it. My very first podcast episode. If you enjoyed my conversation with Kyle, I would be so grateful if you would leave a 5-star review. It really helps get the word out about the podcast. And if you would like to hear more like this, please check out my show notes where you can find how you can stay up to date with Kyle and myself. And don't forget to watch our film, A Place Called Home, wherever you can buy or rent movies. Until next time, this is Shawna.